Did PvP just get saved? Maybe not. Look, I have to give credit where it's due. Game director of Destiny 2, Joe Blackburn, did an amazing job settling some community tensions after a truly horrible state of the game post that Bungie did several days ago. We also got hit with a massive list of balance changes regarding weapons, zoom stats, and a lot more to dig into. But for a diehard PvP fan like myself, I'm still feeling a little bit unsatisfied. If you like to play PvP, just think about it for a second. Do these updates really make you feel excited to play PvP again? Joe said nothing wrong in his video, and honestly, it's refreshing to hear any kind of dialogue regarding a focus on PvP. But I was hoping to hear a little bit more about a few topics which he completely missed. Which, by the way, I think are vastly more important to my actual enjoyment of PvP compared to some of the things that he talked about. For a mega fast recap, if you didn't hear the clip from Joe that he published on Twitter, or I guess X these days, he talked about finally adding some new PvP maps in the form of a map pack, tweaking the competitive PvP experience, and adding a couple new PvP modes. And don't get me wrong, these are all important topics to the PvP gameplay experience. He also said that Bungie would create a PvP strike team in order to more quickly and transparently address some major issues in the Crucible. If you take a quick look at the Twitter or X feed, the response was resoundingly positive and rightfully so. I'm personally really excited to try out the new Checkmate game mode that sounds like a lot of fun. So to Joe, I say job well done for restoring a little bit of hope for those of us who still enjoy PvP despite its many flaws. In particular, I'm really curious to learn more about this new PvP strike team that he mentioned. I specifically remember the vibe of the game changing in a big positive way between Curse of Osiris and Warmind back in seasons 2 and 3. And I suppose the player investment strike team that he mentioned is due a lot of credit for that turnaround. So as delusional as I might be for still being a Destiny PvP fan in 2023, I do have a sliver of hope that just maybe Destiny PvP can have a similar kind of turnaround. But before I put on my rose-tinted glasses, I do have a few complaints of my own that I feel like need to be addressed if we're talking about a plan to make PvP actually good again. So I've locked and loaded my notebook full of them, and I'm ready to hurl them right back at Bungie. Okay, I'm exaggerating, I really only have 3 major complaints, but if you've put any serious time into Destiny PvP, I bet you can relate to at least some of these things. And I also think that these are pretty serious issues that Joe missed out on in the video and really need to be addressed if we're going to turn PvP around. These aren't new problems either. I mean, Bungie's been kind of missing the boat with these problems for the past year or so, and realistically even longer. So here's the 3 major problems which are stopping me and my friends from fully enjoying Destiny 2's PvP in the current state of the game. First up is ability and weapon balance. I know I sound like a broken record for saying this, but hear me out, I think I have a slightly different take than what you're probably used to hearing. The weapons in the current state are pretty well balanced if you think about it. In a raw weapon-to-weapon competition, it's not that easy to predict who's going to win, except maybe in the case of a few outliers. And to be fair, sure, outliers are a problem, but there hasn't been a meta without at least one major outlier in the last 9 years of Destiny that we've experienced so far. It seems like even a part of Bungie's core balance philosophy has been to let certain outliers be a little bit hot for a while and then bring them down and bump up other ones to make a new problem. That way we sort of always have a rotating public enemy number 1 in the Crucible. There's also been some recent chatter about Bungie's data conflicting with the actual player experience, like how they mentioned spare rations being the most effective weapon in the higher skill brackets. You can talk to pretty much any top PvP player and they will make a list of several hand cannons that are flat out better in many ways, so this data point has a lot of us scratching our heads. On the bright side, we learned today that Lemon Arc is finally getting a pretty substantial change, which will hopefully bring that usage down a few pegs. And generally speaking, there's a plethora of changes coming that will affect how important the zoom stat is relative to the effective range, and this is something that I'll definitely be testing and evaluating in depth in the next season. Overall though, I do feel like the weapons are fairly balanced from category to category, and although I personally would like to see a few tweaks here and there, particularly with how dominant SMGs feel in the higher level games, I feel like they've done a generally pretty good job with balance over the past few years to get us to our current sandbox. In terms of abilities, again, given a small exemption of a few outliers, most of the classes and subclasses are actually fairly well balanced right now. You might disagree with me on this one, and sure, the relative balance is definitely not perfect, but I think it's fair to say that we're in one of the best states we've ever had when comparing subclass to subclass. If you've been playing for a while, you might remember some of the eras like the Wormhusk Arcstrider of Season 3, or the Top Tree Dawnblade dominance of early Trials of Osiris. Think about the insane brokenness of Spectral Blades in Season 4 with its original Gwisen vest, which allowed hunters to run around all day long with their super and perpetual wall hacks. Or how about handheld Supernova one-shotting like a shotgun while taking no damage thanks to Controverse holds. And we could probably talk for about an hour about the various ways that the Stasis subclasses were busted over the past few years. These are just a few of the many broken abilities of the past. But these days, I feel like the subclasses and abilities relative to one another are actually reasonably balanced. So then you might ask, why am I complaining? Well, it's because the way that they did it is horrible for PvP, and I really mean that, it's horrible. Bungie balanced the abilities by bringing up the effectiveness floor to be ridiculously powerful, especially in comparison to weapons. And I think this trend started way back in the day when Bungie made it public that their intention with balancing abilities was to give us fewer but more impactful abilities. I guess I can go along with the fewer idea, but I absolutely do not go along with the idea of more impactful abilities in the Crucible. Think about it, more impactful means that it's harder to counter. So if one of these more impactful abilities gets used on you, you're going to have a harder time trying to survive it, or at least avoiding the negative effects that it provides. And that just feels bad to play against. After you die, if you think back to yourself, what could I have done better in that engagement, and the only answer is, sorry, your opponent used a highly impactful ability on you and you really couldn't have countered it, that just feels really bad. The longer cooldowns are one way to tune these abilities, but to me, that's really not good enough. You might be asking yourself what kind of abilities are especially problematic right now, and for you, I have just a few examples. How about this slide melee? Or this trip mine? Or this vortex grenade? This magnetic grenade? This knife? Or this dive? There's so much more of these on every class. And sure, they don't all kill in a single shot, at least usually, but there's almost nothing that you can do to avoid them so often. Child of the Old Gods literally tracks you around a corner, through walls, across massive distances, and then you basically have to accept the fact that it's going to come find you and weaken you. Maybe that doesn't sound like too much of a problem to you, but the damage that it provides is the difference between dying to a hand cannon or just barely surviving. I don't even think I need to get started on the other classes since they have some abilities which are completely impossible to deal with regardless of your skill level. And to mention perhaps the most egregious outlier right now, it's of course Titans with Antaeus wards. I still can't believe that we have an immunity shield that reflects damage right back at you in PvP. It might work well in Super Smash Bros, but in an FPS game I don't think this kind of ability has any place. The real solution to the ability spam problem is not making abilities uncounterable, it's to transform them into some extra utility to enhance your weapons and gunplay instead of being the go-to solution to win every single fight for free. How many times have you encountered a Strand Hunter who refuses to engage you in a 1v1 fight unless they first dive bomb and suspend you? Or how about Stasis Warlocks who must freeze you before they're willing to engage? It shouldn't be less desirable to use your weapons because abilities are just a more effective way to play the game. Okay, this one might sound like a weird example since this particular game launched in such a horrible state, but I've been playing a lot of Battlefield 2042 lately, and I think they actually have a much better take on the ability potency versus weapon potency curve than Destiny. There's likely just as many abilities and arguably even some more broken abilities at the player's disposal. Many of them have even more uptime than those in Destiny, but the weapons in comparison to the abilities are so much more powerful that nobody in their right mind would prefer an ability to just headshotting their opponent with better aim. If someone runs around a corner to heal up after you've damaged them, it doesn't feel like that big of a deal because one good burst and you've put them right back down. Plus you can take down an additional 3 or 4 more enemies with the rest of that same magazine. In Destiny though, if you fight someone who dips behind cover with a healing grenade, they've instantly undone all of your progress of your magazine, and while you're busy reloading, they can instantly have the upper hand just from that single ability usage turning the tables. I'm not saying that we need faster time to kill, by the way. I actually love the general time to kill windows of the Destiny sandbox. My point is that the effectiveness of the abilities relative to the lethality of the weapons is way out of whack. I think we need to get to the point in Destiny where using your primary weapon is the primary answer to an engagement. And even if an ability helps you win an engagement, it needs to be used in some skillful and very tasteful way. Again, to give you an example, I think the handheld Supernova is actually in a pretty decent spot right now. You need to time it just right, and it mostly only bumps your opponent, and the range is limited enough that you really don't want to use it in the majority of your engagements. It's a similar story with the new Strand Warlock melee. It's pretty easy to dodge, and it does so little damage that most of the time just firing your weapon would be a better choice than attempting the melee, but it is there if you want to use it. Again, I'm really excited to try the new checkmate mode because I feel like it's at least a stab in the right direction to solve this issue, but time will tell how good of a job they can do with the balance. Okay, on to point number 2, matchmaking. Oh, matchmaking. Just about every decent player in Destiny history has complained about getting bad teammates at some point in their career. And I admit, oftentimes, deep inside, I do wish for better teammates on my team. But that's actually not what I'm here to complain about. I think the core philosophy of how competitive the main modes are supposed to be is completely backwards right now. Nearly every week this season, I've played my 9 games of competitive grinding for that Mercurial Overreach Sniper, which by the way, I finally got a great role and it is awesome. Anyway, grinding comp each week has been really an eye-opening experience for me since admittedly I didn't play a whole lot of comp in the previous few seasons. I need to first point out that I'm not some insane Destiny player. I have the luxury of selecting clips on YouTube that make me seem much better than I really am since I can cut out all the deaths just like any other YouTuber. In reality, I'm probably somewhere in the upper middle of the pack, but definitely not winning any big tournaments anytime soon. Despite this, just by playing with half of my brain turned on and not really trying to get wins at all, I've reached the adept rank this season by playing the absolute minimum games to get my 3 chances at the sniper each week, 1 per character. I literally played my 9 games and then dip out every single week. If you're unfamiliar, Adept is the second highest rank on the entire ladder, only below Ascendant. This was primarily with me playing only as a solo player, and there were a few games where I played with a friend very casually, but we were really just aiming to complete our 9 weekly games in order to get the sniper rifle. The odd thing was that the way the matchmaking system is set up, it almost felt like the games got easier and easier the more I climbed up the ladder. The first few ranks felt insanely sweaty, like I was playing tournament players every single game, and these toughest games were down in the ranks at the very bottom of the ladder. Joe mentioned in his video how the point allocation on wins and losses was being adjusted, so we shouldn't see such a massive swing of points on a loss, and I do think that's a really good idea. But I have to wonder if the whole system is working as intended in the first place. Shouldn't the games get noticeably harder as you climb up to the top of the ranks? I mean, that's how it works in basically every other competitive game that I have ever played. Unless you're a Smurf or some god tier player, you're probably not going to just magically climb up the Valorant or CSGO ladders just by playing for fun and goofing around every game. You have to put in some serious effort to learn the utility lineups, learn the most effective strategies, improve your aim, and develop some really good communication with your teammates in order to climb. But in Destiny, it seemed like the complete opposite was almost true. I felt like the higher up on the ladder that I was getting, the easier the matches were getting, and that really just makes no sense to me. If competitive is in theory supposed to be this place where we develop ourselves as players to grow our skill and climb up the ladder, then it seems to me like we should also have a place that is the complete opposite experience. A place to just relax and play against a wide variety of skill levels where the outcome of each match is mostly irrelevant and instead the focus is just on having a fun time and using whatever loadouts you might want to explore. But the actual casual experience is not this at all right now, at least for me. If you load into a control game on an account that's deemed anything close to high skill by Bungie, you'll likely be matched against only super sweaty players who are playing like their lives depend on the outcome of the match. It really feels like there's some $1 million tournament on the line compared to the more casual experience of the competitive playlist, which again is completely backwards. You may disagree, but to me, I feel like comp should be the only place with the skill-based or really actually ideally ranked-based matchmaking, and the casual experience should be casual in nature where you just play against a wide variety of skill that varies from game to game. If you're an average skilled player, which most of us are, then most of your games will have opponents of a similar skill level naturally, and you're going to have a few outliers on either side of the spectrum. And this brings us to issue number 3. I bet many of you are dying to hear this one, the netcode. Do I really need to say much here? The abysmal connection quality in PvP exacerbates all of the issues that we've already talked about in the first 2 points. It really makes all of the game so much worse than it could be. I feel like a big reason that so much of the aim assist exists in the first place in this game is because netcode can't even correctly compute where your bullets actually went. So in some jumble of approximations, your accuracy gets either rewarded or punished based on your connection. I think it's really common that shots that are way off target somehow still connect, and shots that when you slow them down on video and look closely, they obviously hit, but they don't get registered as a hit. And don't even get me started on damage glitches. Sometimes your bullets will deal 2 or 3 times extra damage thanks to these poor connections, and it's a major issue that many players are completely in the dark about. The reason that high skill, high reward things don't work that well in Destiny, think of something like flux grenades for example, is because half of the time your actual skill does not get rewarded adequately because the connections are so bad at computing what's actually going on. Why do you think that fusion rifles pose such a major threat? Well, part of it is that the netcode can't accurately transmit the charge up sound so that you know when it's safe to actually peek your opponent. I've been curious about this for a long time, and we've actually timed the latency across very local connections to get an idea of what's going on, and sometimes this can be as high as 300 milliseconds or 300 ping. That's somewhere between half and a third of your weapon's optimal time to kill. And that's not even to mention the tick rate of these peer-to-peer server connections, which is rarely mentioned by Bungie. In games like CSGO, the top players will lose their minds if the servers they play on are less than 128 tick, yet in Destiny it seems like we're lucky to get even a tenth of that server update rate. And these issues start to grow far worse when we start adding distance between the players being connected. So if you're in the US and you're matching with players spread all across Europe, Asia, and South America because the game prioritizes your skill-based matchmaking over connection-based matchmaking, you're gonna really feel those awful latencies. Plus, these issues felt by high pings are actually more impactful as you climb up higher on the skill ladder. This is where the players are more likely to hit those optimal time to kill marks, and they're going to be able to land those lethal abilities more often. When you mix in multi-hundred milliseconds of latency, it's no wonder why so often you're killed around a corner or without even seeing your opponent at all. Developers from Bungie have publicly talked about how the game prioritizes the feel of the players doing the shooting in terms of the connections registering bullets. So if your opponent happens to have a terrible connection to you, and if they see you on their screen even though you don't see them at all, you're going to die to them and it's going to feel awful and unfair. Of course, the request of most players who are familiar with competitive online gaming is to move PvP over to dedicated servers, but at this point in Destiny's lifecycle, that's extremely unlikely to happen. At a minimum though, I think prioritizing matchmaking based on connections instead of skill would at least help alleviate a lot of these issues. I want to go full circle on this topic once again and mention that despite these glaring issues, PvP was so neglected that the things that Joe did mention are huge steps forward. Even if some of these main issues that I have with the game weren't mentioned directly, I do think that we have at least some reason to see a light at the end of the tunnel. The map packs that they mentioned are a huge improvement over drip feeding 0 to 1 maps every few years. If we get maps with all sorts of different flavors, then the likelihood that we're going to get something really good is much higher. Nobody wants another disjunction, but if it's disjunction paired with another javelin, then that's a much better deal. Stale maps have strongly contributed to the stale state of PvP overall, even if I do believe that it's less of a problem relative to the other major gripes outlined in the video. The change that Joe mentioned to the comp system point distribution on wins and losses is actually a really good change. It's a simple one, but there's a lot of effectiveness and utility in that simplicity. Right now, the algorithm attempts to guess who should have performed better in a comp game and rewards or punishes you accordingly. But that can end up with you losing huge amounts of points on just one loss, and oftentimes that's just caused by an unfortunate timeout or a connection dip, or even just a teammate who's actively throwing. A more consistent way of giving out or taking away points based on wins and losses, while maybe not ideal, is definitely an improvement compared to today's state. By necessity, I believe it will more accurately reflect player skill, and that actually makes the comp experience more consistent and more predictable for everyone, which alleviates at least some of the major pain points in today's comp. Speaking of which, he also mentioned that they are removing Rift from the competitive modes, which is a very welcome change. Playing it all season felt like a chore every single time it popped up, and I'm really happy they're getting rid of it, although I'm not so sure that Countdown is all that much better. I guess we'll see next season. I'm also genuinely excited to learn more about this new PvP strike team. I hope that they do a really good job of listening to feedback carefully and bringing some real passion back to PvP. I won't forget the good job that the other strike team did in Warmind, and I'm cautiously optimistic for the future. I know that communication with the player base can be a rough process at times, and that people are not very inclined to show a lot of compassion, so serious props to Bungie for at least committing to keep working on it. After years of feeling ignored, it's refreshing to at least see some semblance of effort put back into these modes that nearly half of the community plays on some regular basis. I'm going to be keeping my eyes peeled for the final shape reveal and whatever's next in Destiny's future, and I'm really hoping that Bungie doesn't disappoint us with the direction that they're taking, at least for their sake.